This particular stage of our national greenhouse gas inventories, it is a provisional inventory, and this will lead ultimately to final numbers being submitted to the UN in March of 2026 and to the EU in March of 2026 and to the UN in April of 2026. And our top line figure for our provisional inventory in 2024 is that our greenhouse gas emissions currently sit at 53.75 million tonnes, the lowest recorded in the 35-year time series since 1990. This represents a 2% reduction on 2023 of in around 1.1 million tonnes. Emissions across all key sectors have decreased this year, except for heating and buildings. So space heating and water heating in our homes, our businesses, and our public spaces. Emissions in the energy sector are also at an historic low. In terms of national compliance, 82.5% of our carbon budget has now been used, with 17.5% now remaining for the final year of the first carbon budget. And since 2005, under the EU effort sharing regulation, our emissions have decreased by just under 11%, quite a distance to the target of 42% reduction by 2030. Some more detailed highlights. So as mentioned, within the electricity sector, which is now at a current historic low, emissions decreased by 8.9% in 2024. And this is largely due to an increase in the level of importation of electricity, now 14% in comparison to 9.5% in 2023, an ongoing large share of renewable energy of just under 40%. Agriculture emissions have decreased by 1.7% in 2024, and this has been largely driven by the 2.9% reduction in cattle, which is partially counteracted by 11% increase in fertilizer nitrogen use. And again, that increase in fertilizer nitrogen use was on the back of an almost 17% decrease in 2023. Residential emissions have increased after 2 consecutive years of all-time lows, and that increase was 4.9%. Again, this is primarily due to 2024 having more heating degree days, 6.3% more heating degree days than 2023. Transport emissions have decreased by 1.2%, and this is the first decrease in transport emissions post-COVID. Like that, we would have been reporting 6% increases in 2021, 2022, and a 0.3% increase in 2023. So again, good to see a 1.2% decrease in such a large sector. Overall, inclusive of LULUCF, our emissions in 2024 were 12% below our 2018 baseline. Again, a distance to the 51% reduction needed by 2030. So that's an overview of the full time series. We can see from 1990, our emissions in 2024 are now 3.6% below that baseline, of just close to under 2 million tonnes below the 1990 level. Putting that change into context, that 2% change is a 1.09 million tonne change on 2023. And again, this is on the back of a 4 million tonne change that we saw, or a reduction in 2023, the largest single year reduction in our national emissions outside of a recessionary period. Across the full timeline from 1990 to 2024, you can see agriculture has maintained its largest share of our emissions, fluctuating between 30 and now 38% of our national total emissions. In contrast, transport has doubled its share of our national total emissions, going from 9.2% in 1990 to now almost 22% in 2024. Over this timescale, the energy share has declined substantially due to high degree of fuel switching, more efficient generation, more efficient electricity generation, and of course the growth in renewables. Industrial process emissions have declined, but again, since 1990, this has been largely due to industries moving out of Ireland, rather than the declines that we're seeing more recently within the industry sector. And all the other sectors have remained relatively stable in comparison. Just to put these changes into a bit of broader context too, since 1990, we've seen almost 4-fold increase in national income in comparison to relatively stable emissions that now, thankfully, in the last 2 years are now below our 1990 levels. In terms of another pressure, upward pressure on emissions, our population has increased from 3.5 million to 5.4 million in 2024. But in comparison, the 54% increase that we've seen in our population has actually resulted, or we have now driven effectively a 37% decrease in our per capita emissions, going from 15.9 tons per person in 1990 down to 10 tons per person in 2024. Again, the lowest in the 35-year record. But when we look at our emissions per capita in comparison with other member states within the EU 27, and this is based on latest data, which is 2023, not 2024, we can see that we rank second highest in the EU 27 in terms of our per capita emissions at 10.3 tons per person, in comparison to the 6.9 tons per person, which would be the EU average. Particular note here is also the composition of gases making up that 10.3 tons within Ireland. 3 tons of methane per capita is the highest level within the EU 27, compared to the average, as an example, of 0.9 tons of methane per person in the EU average. The country that would be closest to us with that would then be Denmark at 1.4 tons of methane per capita. Moving to compliance. Under the EU effort-sharing regulations, Ireland's target is to achieve a 42% reduction in 2030 on 2005 levels. And to achieve that target, annual emission allocations, or limits within which we're to keep our emissions, are calculated on an annual basis. And in 2024, that annual emission allocation was 38.68 million tonnes. But our emissions in 2024 were 42.42 million tonnes. Again, just to note, the emissions under this EU effort-sharing regulation are what we call non-ETS emissions. So ETS emissions are energy producers and large industry, whereas this particular compliance target relates to all the non-ETS emissions, so largely agriculture, transport and buildings. There is a flexibility available to Ireland in terms of sort of a fair and cost-effective way of achieving these emissions, and it's called, in this particular instance, there's an ETS flexibility. But in terms of even with the use of that flexibility in 2024, we are still exceeding our annual emission allocation. And cumulatively from 2021 to 2024, we're still exceeding the 4 years of annual emission allocations in the order of around 2 million tonnes. In terms of national compliance, we have a national ambition to reduce emissions by 51% by 2030. At present, inclusive LULUCF, our emissions in 2024 are only 12% below that 2018 baseline. So there is quite a gap to 51%. And for us to get to that 51% in 2030, from 2025 onwards, on average, we would need a 9% reduction in emissions per year. In terms of our first carbon budget of 295 million tonnes, 82.5% of that carbon budget has now been used, leaving 17.5% for 2025. In terms of the various different sectors and their own sectoral emission ceilings and budgets effectively for that first carbon budget period, after 4 years, we would expect on average most sectors to be 80%. We can see most sectors are in excess of that 80% and now need larger reductions in 2025. And the next slide will illustrate that a little bit better, and is also included in the report. Just to note, in terms of the agriculture sector emission ceilings, the methodological changes and update to science that would have been brought into the 2023 inventory have changed the agriculture inventory sufficiently that we think that the comparison of the agriculture inventory emissions is no longer viable against the sectoral emission ceiling and would require revision. So just to interpret this, you can see in total for 2025, our national emissions now need to decrease by 10.3% in 2025 to stay within the first carbon budget. As I was saying, within agriculture at present, given the change in inventory, Technically, agriculture could increase its emissions by 3.4% and still stay within its first carbon budget. But again, we feel given the significant change in agriculture inventory due to the update in science, that comparison is no longer viable. In contrast, in the other sector, this is a particular sector where we have seen significant decreases. And again, potentially it could increase its emissions by 30% in 2025 and still stay within its first carbon budget. In contrast, there are two particular sectors that have the greatest challenge in terms of reduction in 2025, namely industry and transport, both of which require a 34% decrease in 2025 to stay within their first carbon budget. And then just finally for this section, we have the reductions to date in terms of the change in emissions from 2018 to 2024. And we see the largest reductions in the sectors of electricity, other, and residential buildings, where electricity has decreased by 32%. The other sector, which includes waste, petroleum refining, and F-gases, has decreased by 20%, and residential buildings have also decreased by 20%. By contrast, there are two sectors, the two largest sectors of the inventory, both agriculture and transport, have only reduced by 4.6 and 5.3% respectively. So to achieve the national climate ambition of 51%, the two largest sectors very much need to accelerate the reductions in combination of the reductions we're seeing with all sectors. Okay, that's where I'll end, and I will hand over to our inventory lead, Paul, to take on the more detailed sectoral summaries.
Yes, agriculture, this is the largest sector in our greenhouse gas inventory, and it has been for all years from 1990 to 2024. Emissions in 1990 were 20.6 million tons, and in the end year, they're down to 20.4 million tons. So it's a 0.8% decrease across the 35 years. Last year in 2023, we actually saw the largest decrease on record for agriculture was down 4.8%. And this year is down 1.7%. As Tomas mentioned earlier, it's really down to the decrease in the cattle herd this year, 2.9% decrease in cattle numbers. And we had a rebound of fertilizer use of 11% after a couple of very low years of fertilizer consumption. So milk production is also up 1.3% in 2024. Liming is down 0.9%, and urea application is up 24%. Let's just look at the gas share between the agricultural inventory, and you can see methane is the most important gas across the time series, about 70% to 71% in the last year. I suppose peak methane was in 1998. Peak emissions were in 1998, and there was 15.6 million tons of methane there. So carbon dioxide emissions are up 16% across the time series. And these come from liming, urea use, and fossil fuel combustion. And N2O emissions are down 11% since 1990. And N2O emissions, nitrous oxide emissions, come from nitrogen excretion on soils, from pasture, from animals, and also from fertilizer use, chemical fertilizer use. And methane, obviously, that's from bovines mostly, enteric fermentation. Is the biggest source, and manure management. There are some methane losses from manure management as well. The drivers, livestock numbers, I mean, the index here, 100 from 1990, dairy cattle in 1990 were 1.34 million, and now in 2024, they are 1.55 million. And in the last 10 years, you can see the increase is 32% in dairy cattle numbers with the removal of milk quotas. And other cattle have declined from 5.48 million in 1990 just down to 5.45 million in 2024. And there isn't a huge trend in the last 10 years. It's only about 3.7% down. Fertilizer use, as I mentioned, it was that baseline is 380,000 tons of chemical N, and in 2024 we're down now at 310,000 tons of chemical N. But you can see the big reductions in the last 3 years. In 2022, reduced by 14%, 2023 by 18%. So it went from 343 kilotons down to 280, and now it's come back up slightly again to 310 kilotons. Another driver is the milk production from the dairy herd. Dairy numbers, you can see we're up at 1.3 million cattle in 1990, and now it's 1.55 million cattle. The milk production really has ramped up in the last 10 or 15 years. So we're now producing 8.4 billion litres in 2024. Slight reduction last year, and it's down from, I suppose, peak milk production was 2022 at 8.8 million litres. The yield per cow is up 36% since 1990, and it's 11% higher in 2024 than it was in 2014. And just to show the emissions from a dairy animal over time, as I said, 101 kilograms of the emission comes from enteric fermentation. So this is the ruminant animal, and the emissions from belching. And 13 kilograms of methane come from manure management. And that kind of 13 kilograms is kind of steady across time. But what you can see from this time series is that the enteric fermentation methane has gone from 101 to 120 as animals. And that's really about the feed intake of an animal and the breeding of animals to produce more and more milk per cow. And just the context of that, so it's 133 kilograms in 2024, and that's a 16.5% increase per cow since 1990. And that's about 3.7 tons of CO2 equivalent per dairy cow per annum. Other cattle, so this be the beef herd and sucklers, we have 46 kilograms, 46.5 kilograms in 2024, which is down actually from 51.8 kilograms in 1990. That's a 10% decrease. So these animals are about 1.5 tons of CO2 equivalent per annum. The other livestock populations within the agricultural sector, sheep are down 36% since 1990. That's the green line. And pigs are up 29% since 1990. So we're talking about 1.2 million pigs in 1990 to 1.6 million pigs in 2024. And sheep were 8 million animals in 1990, and they're down to 5.1 million animals in 2024. And actually, since last year, sheep have declined by 8% since 2023. And finally, poultry. Poultry is up 69% since the base year, and that's about 11.8 million birds up to about 19.9 million in 2024. We'll move on now to transport. This is the transport time series for the last 35 years. There was some extraordinary increases in transport in the decade between 1990 and 2000, and even on up to peak transport in 2007. In some years, we had increases of over 17%. But you can see the COVID interaction here went down 15.6% in 2020, and then it came back up 6.6 and 6% in 21-22. Small increase again last year. But this is the first year we've had a decrease since COVID, and it's a 1.2% decrease. And what's really driving this is the blended biofuel, the share of biofuel in biodiesel and petrol has increased substantially this year by 16%. And biofuels now are saving about 1 million tons from the overall emission of 11.65 million tons. Transport peaked, as I said, in 2007 at 14.4 million tonnes. And road transport within this sector is about 95% of all emissions. And this is just the fuel consumed in road transport. You can see in 1990, we used about 66 petajoules of energy. So you can see there petrol and diesel. And in 2024, we use about 165 petajoules of energy. And biofuels are beginning to make an impact. As I said, there's 15 petajoules of biofuels there, which is about half of what petrol consumption is. And that's, cumulatively since 2005, biofuels have saved 7.3 million tonnes of emissions and just over 1 million tonnes last year. But it's very obvious. You can see the next slide also will show with the car numbers is the switching in 2007 based on the CO2 banding of road vehicles to switching from petrol vehicles to diesel vehicles. And that can be seen here again in this, the number of vehicles on the road. There was 1.3 million diesel cars in 2024 and 1 million petrol vehicles. Petrol vehicles are becoming more popular again with the petrol hybrid and plug-in hybrids, and less diesel cars been sold, but still they make up a bigger share. But the top here, you can just see the battery electric vehicles and the plug-in hybrids. They're a small share, and you can see it better in this slide. In 2024, there were just over 82,000 BEVs, battery electric vehicles, and over 66,500 PHEVs. So these are plug-in hybrids. So the Climate Action Plan has a target here of 138,000. So we're slightly ahead of that target. Different share, obviously. There was 102,000 BEVs planned in the plan and 35,000 plug-in hybrids, but there's a slightly different share in the real world. Just the context around a battery electric vehicle, like the 80,000 battery electric vehicles will save about 200,000 tons of emissions per annum. And just, I suppose, the context of that is that biofuels are saving 1 million tons. So every vehicle that has an engine, a combustion engine, is burning biofuels, whereas a very small proportion of cars on the road are purely battery electric. There's always an interest in international aviation. This is not including a national total, but we're an island. We like to fly, and it's one of the principal ways of getting off the island is obviously by air transport. In 1990, there was about 95,000 landing and takeoff cycles in Ireland, and that emitted about 1 million tons of emissions. And now in 2024, there are over 145,000 landing and takeoff cycles, and that's responsible for about 3.3 million tons of emissions. And I said they're not in the national compliance total, they're not in the numbers under the Paris Agreement, they're considered a memo item. And I would move on to energy industries. This really covers public electricity, the refineries, so the refinery in Cork, the oil refinery, the gas refinery in Pallanaboy, and solid fuel industries historically, where peat briquetting plants no longer there, of course, and then fugitive losses of natural gas from the gas network make up a small share of the emissions. But over the time period, you can see the emissions are 37% below 1990, and most of this was down to fuel switching and renewables in the public electricity and heat production. And in the last year, the emissions were down 9%, nearly 8.9%, and that followed a 21% decrease in 2023. So there is some hope for the electricity sector, sectoral emissions ceiling, that they have shown they can reduce emissions by 20% per annum. And I think they have a challenging target to meet the budget for next year. But you can see in the next slide, the breakdown to fuel used for electricity generation. I mean, it was predominantly coal, peat, and oil in the early part of the time series, and now gas, renewables, and imports of electricity are really the three big shares in 2024. Like when you think in 2025, now we've stopped coal. 2024 was the first year we never burnt peat, so since 1950. So the Eden Dairy Power Station has moved over to 100% biomass. So peat is off the grid. Coal will be off the grid since last month in 2025. So going forward, all of our electricity will be coming from gas, renewables, or interconnection. Net imports of electricity, which is of interest to a lot of people, went up 55% last year. As Tomas said, that's about 9.5% share in 2023 and 14% share in 2024. So that's like 5,000 gigawatt hours of, 36,000 gigawatts on the grid. And this just shows the impact of solid fuel use on the grid since 1990. Coal and peat were responsible for 57% of electricity generated, but 72% of emissions in 1990. And now in the end year, there's still coal from Money Point. There's no peat anymore. There's over 600,000 tons of emissions, and that's 9% of the share, and it's only producing 2% of the electricity. And the big shares in the electricity, what's taking up that now is the wind renewables, and you can see we have a baseline of hydroelectric power going back since 1990, but really the rollout of wind electricity generation since the early 2000s, and you can see now renewables making up around 39-40% of all electricity per annum. The other source of renewables here, there's Eden Dairy, as I said, 100% biomass, and there's some electricity from waste to energy and from landfill gas and biogas. And just to show the imports, the net imports over the years, we had some years where we were a net exporter of electricity, but you can see the big growth in the last 2 years, the interconnection with the UK. And there was another interconnector that came online in 2025, the Green Link interconnector. So there is potential, I suppose, going forward for more electricity imports. And all of this has an effect then on carbon intensity of the electricity on the grid. It was near a kilogram per kilowatt hour back in 1990, and now it's down to an historic low of 226 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. Now, obviously, there's no energy intensity or carbon intensity associated with imports. So the more we import, the lower this number will go in the future. So renewables accounted for 39.6% in 2024, and gas 42%. But between the fossil fuels, coal, oil, and peat, they only accounted for 3.4% of all electricity generated in the final year. And lastly, we have a few slides on residential. I mean, this is another story about fuel switching over time. You can see we had an awful lot of solid fuel heating in the early 1990s, and that share has gone down by over 80%. And oil and gas have taken up the bulk of all of that switching from coal and peat. Emissions are the increase 4.9% this year, but there was historic lows in 2022 and 2023. These were exceptionally mild winters and the heating season. And this year we saw an increase in heating demand of 6.3% degree days. And that had an effect of burning more coal, 7%, oil, kerosene, if you have a kerosene boiler, 9%, and gas use went up 3%. The decrease in peat mentioned in the infographic here is really just peat briquettes. They're no longer available as the briquetting plants have closed. So what is the household emissions per household? You can see we had 1 million households in 1990, and now we've 1.92 million households in 2024. and emissions have decreased per household from 7.5 tonnes per household to 2.9 tonnes per household in 2024. And we had an historic low of 2.8 tonnes per household in 2023. We have a lot more ambient heat coming through. This is from heat pumps. So, in the end year, in 2024, you can see this 19% increase year on year. There's 4.5 petajoules of ambient heat in our homes, and there's 80 petajoules of fossil energy. So it's about 5%, and it's increasing rapidly. And this is coming from heat pumps. So this will be the number of heat pumps installed annually and the cumulative amount of heat pumps. So going forward, all new builds will have heat pumps, or they won't have fossil use boilers in the home. So we'll continue to increase the amount of households, but we shouldn't be increasing the burden on fossil fuel combustion per household. So we should see the per household reduction continuing as the time series goes on. Finally, I have a slide just to show the other sectors. Manufacturing combustion sector decreased by 0.3%. Look, there's a lot going on in the manufacturing sector. It's mixed. There were quite substantial increases in non-metallic minerals. So that would be Ortnish alumina. It was up 11%. And chemicals, food showed 3% decreases in the ETS. But the big change to offset the increase in gas use in alumina was cement combustion. Cement was down 16.8% in 2024, and that's gone from 0.87 million tonnes to 0.72 million tonnes. And that's directly in line with the reduction in clinker production. So there was a decrease in waste as well. That's primarily methane from landfills. That decreased by 0.7% in 2024, and the landfills decreased by 1.4%. So we had a reduction in the amount of methane generated, and we also had a reduction in the amount of methane captured for flaring and utilization. And F gases are up 2.7%. I mean, this is one of the most provisional numbers at this time of year. The F gas inventory is there's a lot of data to still come in at this time of the year. And emissions from commercial and public, these are the other heating sectors we mentioned that affected by the extra degree days, increased by 8.5% and 7.5% respectively. And that's really down to the amount of gas. Gas use went up 8.4% and oil went up 6.8%. So I think I'll leave it at that.